a lot of the Jewish people today will tell you that they've returned from captivity. That Israel is the Jewish people is all of Israel, and the 10 tribes have returned. But the rabbis and the academics and the scholars will tell you, no, we know that there's a difference. Whether or not that difference actually gets passed down to the laity inside of Judaism in the synagogues is one thing. But at the top of the scholastic, academic, theological food chain in Judaism, they know that there are two houses. They know that Israel today is only of the 2 tribes in the south. They know that the 10 tribes are still lost. Matter of fact, the Orthodox pray for the 10 tribes 3 times a day. And so we can't say that anybody has returned from the 10 tribes, that the 10 tribes have returned, because the prophets say that it hasn't happened yet, and even modern scholars say it hasn't happened yet. Even in the Mishnah, which is a compilation of Jewish history and writings and halakha. There is writings in the Mishnah of 2 rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva, his view is this on the 10 tribes. The 10 tribes will not return, for it is said, and cast them into another land as it is this day. Just as the day goes and does not return, so they too went and will not return. So Rabbi Akiva says about the 10 tribes, he says they're not going to return. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is to show that this is after the time of Christ. This is hundreds of years later, and they're still talking about whether or not the tribes should return. So it could not have happened in the first century, or Judaism itself would not even be having this conversation, because Rabbi Eliezer says in response, as this day, just as this day, darkens and then becomes light again, so the 10 tribes, even as it went dark for them, so will it become light for them. So the point is that we've got written record of 2 rabbis going at it saying, I don't believe they're going to come back. I do believe they're going to come back. So what by default can we deduct from both of those? They're not back. Even the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the IMFA says this: the exile to Babylonia, which followed the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, marked the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. Do you realize how important this is for the IMFA to make this statement? Because the northern kingdom was exiled 130 years earlier. By default, they're admitting that the first dispersion was not the Jewish people, but the house of Israel. For you Gentiles, this may not be an important message, but I know for my Jewish brethren, this is an important slide. Because you have all been taught generically that the Jewish people were dispersed, and that was all 12 tribes. But even your own organizations, again, at the highest levels of academia, admit that the first dispersion of the Jewish people was 586 BC going to Babylon, because that's the house of Judah. Let's get into the New Testament a little bit, and let me ask this paramount question. Have you ever wondered why pagan Gentiles who hated the Jews, anti-Semitic as they come, would so readily accept a Jewish Messiah? So a rabbi, Paul, Rav Shaul in his Hebrew tongue, is going around to different cities, and he's supposedly preaching to pagans. And 100,000 people convert to Christ in just the city of Ephesus. All of these are polytheistic pagan gods, sun god worshipers. They got 1,000 different gods. They don't even need another god, much less a Jewish God of which they can't stand to begin with. Why would they accept a Jewish Messiah? I'm going to suggest to you something, because many of these Gentiles were not pagan Gentiles. They were Israelite Gentiles. Let's dig into this and find out if this crazy theory is true. Peter says this in verse 1. Now you have some definitions from the Tanakh, the Old Testament. We can actually unravel some incredible mysteries in the New Testament. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. Right off the bat, where Peter is using terminology that he's not making up. Every one of his Jewish brethren knows that the word scattered comes from the prophecies of scattering the northern house of Israel. There's only one people in the entire Bible that are called the elect, and that is Israel of the Old Testament. Now, some of you, that might bother you, but let me finish what I'm going to say. We've been talking for hundreds of years now trying to figure out this whole doctrine of election. Books have been written, Calvinism, Arminianism, once saved, always saved. You can all these things. The doctrine of election is very simple. And predestination is very simple. God elected His people, scattered them, predestined for the elect to come back. That is the definition of predestination right there in a nutshell. You can't look at it from your 21st century Western Greco-Roman post-Catholic backgrounds in English. But if you dive into the original scriptures and you dive into the Tanakh and the Old Testament and the Hebrew scriptures and the concepts that are there, it's God's people are elect. He moves them into captivity, and a select elect, those that obey His voice in His commandments and His ordinances and so on and so forth, become the remnant that are predestined to come back. And that's what we see in the New Testament. James says this in his book, first chapter. James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who were scattered abroad. His book is to the 12 tribes. Bible students, listen to what I'm saying. It's not written to Gentiles. He's telling us who it's written to. He's writing to the tribes of Israel. All 12, in fact. Now we know who the sheep are. Watch this, because all these verses are going to pop out like 3D. John chapter 10, verse 3 says, the watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow because they know his voice. Now, every one of us have grown up in church, have always read these scriptures, because when you get saved, where do they start you? John. At the back of the book. That's like handing you a novel and saying, go to chapter 13 and start there. You'll learn everything you need to know. But like my friend says, God is so smart that He knew we were going to send everybody to John chapter 1, verse 1, which is why it starts out saying, in the beginning. He's trying to tell us something. Go back to the beginning. Don't start here. And if you go back to the beginning, what you discover as the only definition, as we have explained, the only definition of sheep in the entire Bible, from this author's perspective, these Jewish authors' perspective, is the sheep are equal to the tribes of Israel. So when you get to the New Testament and Yeshua, Jesus, is giving these analogies and these parables and these stories about sheep, who do you think He's talking to and referring to? And look what we have done in our third grade education in theology as Christians worldwide, according to theologians, by the way, is we have read into the New Testament scriptures, oh, we are the sheep. Actually not even knowing what we're really saying.